Welcome to the 2026 Dialogue, a masterclass series by the HR Association of India. I am Neha Jignani, and today we are exploring a shift that is quietly but fundamentally reshaping how organizations operate, moving from designing jobs to designing work. Our theme for this session is designing work, not jobs, the shift every organization must make. To explore this, we are joined by Danish Shaikh. Danish is a HR and organizational development leader with over 16 years of experience in building high performing, future ready organizations. He currently heads the HR Center of Excellence at ACG Capsules and is pursuing a PhD focused on psychological safety, allyship, and inclusive leadership. He has led enterprise wide HR transformations and built talent systems aligned with business outcomes. An award winning professional, Danish has been recognized as Asia HR Director of the Year and a 40 under 40 honoree. He is also an ICF-certified coach and a published researcher, with his work presented at global forums including Oxford. Danish, thank you so much for joining. It's a pleasure having you.
Thank you so much for having me. And today, when we are talking about redesigning work, you know, as HR professionals, we jump to structures, frameworks, and I think in today's conversation, we'll just talk about whether our current ways of working are still fit for that or not. I think let's keep it conversational and let's see how it goes.
Absolutely. I look forward to this exciting masterclass, Danish. So, to begin with, my first question for you is organizations have traditionally designed roles as fixed jobs. So, I want to know what is really driving the shift towards designing the work instead, and are we even solving the right problem?
That's a great question. And let me start very simply. Okay. Most people say this shift is about agility. But I think that's only one part of the story. Now, the real reason is that the nature of work itself has changed.
Right.
Uh, you know, the way we design organizations at the same time has not changed. Earlier jobs worked well because work was stable. If
Right.
you go back 15, 20 years around the time when I had started my career, uh, work was predictable, roles were clearly defined. People did a set of tasks repeatedly. So, people created fixed job descriptions at that time. So you could very clearly say, this is your role, this is your responsibility, this is how your performance will be measured. And it worked well, right? Because the environment at that time was stable.
Right.
Now, today, if you look around, the work doesn't behave like that anymore. Now, uh, if you think about how work happens today, problems are rarely, limited to one function.
Right.
Work changes quickly. You need inputs from multiple people at the same time. So instead of asking, what does this role do? We are now asking, what problem are we trying to solve? And who can contribute to it? And that itself is a big shift.
Sure.
Now, if I give you a simple example, of a customer escalation, imagine a customer is unhappy, maybe because of a delay or a quality issue. Now, on paper, sorry, roles are very clear. Sales handles the client, operation handles the delivery, quality handles compliance. But in reality, when something goes wrong, sales is talking to the customer, operations is trying to fix the issue, quality is checking what went wrong, leaders are stepping in. Now, here's the problem. Even though roles are clear, the issue doesn't get solved smoothly because people stay within their boundaries. Ownership becomes unclear, decisions take time. So, the problem is not that roles are unclear. The problem is the work needed to solve the issue cuts across roles, and our structure is not designed for that.
Sure.
So, that's one aspect. Similarly, contribution today is about capability, not about role. And if you think about work earlier, your role decided what your contribution is. Today, it's your skills and capabilities that decide that.
Sure.
For example, an operations person today may need to understand data, might need to understand automation. A quality person may need to understand business impact. So, value is created when the right people bring the right skills to solve a problem, not just when they stay within their JD. You know, and this is where organizations often go wrong.
Sure.
Now, why companies make a mistake, they say, let's make roles more flexible, let's move to skill based models, but they don't change the system. Because performance is still measured based on your role, promotions are role based, accountability is fixed. So even if you say be flexible, people might still think, uh, tell me exactly what my role is, right? Because that is what the system eventually revolves. System eventually rewards. The real problem is it's not job versus work. It's not uh, structure versus flexibility. It is how do we handle, you know, dynamic cross-functional work without creating any confusion. Because too much of structure also makes you slow. Too much of flexibility creates chaos, and you need that kind of balance. So,
Yes.
you know, instead of saying design work, not jobs, I would say let work be flexible, but keep your accountability clear. You know, work can move across people and teams, but at some time, at any given point, someone needs to very clearly own the outcome. And that is what makes it work in real life. And that is also how, that is what you need in case of a mindset shift for leaders. You know, earlier leaders used to ask, who owns this? Now they need to ask, how do we solve this together? And who is responsible for making sure it gets solved? Both are important.
Sure.
So if I had to simplify everything into one line, I would say the problem is not how we design jobs, it's how we define and deliver value. And until we change that thinking, just making roles more flexible won't really solve anything.
Sure, sure. Beautifully put. I loved how you started that shift is not about agility, the way jobs are evolving and changing. Beautiful example there on the customer bit. And of course, as you rightly said, that contribution is not just about your role, it's about the capability of the person. It's not job versus work, but it's maintaining that right balance between accountability, structure, and flexibility. Thank you so much for beautifully putting it together. So, Danish, my next question to you is many organizations talk about moving to skill-based, flexible work models, but structurally remain hierarchy-driven. So, from your experience, what actually prevents this shift from becoming real?
So let me start with a simple truth. Okay. Most organizations don't struggle because they don't want to change. They struggle because their systems are not built for that change. You know, the bottom line is, and which becomes the biggest barrier, is that structure still drives everything. Even if companies say we are becoming skill based, their structure still looks like, clear hierarchy, fixed roles, defined reporting lines. And that structure drives decision making, accountability, career progression. So
Right,
even if you say that anyone can contribute based on skills, in reality, people still think this is not my role, so I won't step in because the structure doesn't support that behavior.
right,
If I take a simple example of a product launch in a company, okay, ideally you want marketing, sales, operations, R&D to work together from day one.
yeah,
But what happens in most organizations, R&D finishes first, they hand over to operations, then marketing comes in, and then sales picks it up. It becomes a relay race instead of a team sport. And why? Because each function is measured separately. Each role has its own KPIs. There's no shared ownership of the outcome. So even if people have the skills to collaborate, the system pushes them back into silos. The second barrier there is how do we measure performance? And this is a big one, because most organizations still evaluate people based on their role, their function, their individual goals. So if I step outside my role to help solve a bigger problem, it will not reflect in my performance. It may even slow down my own targets. So naturally, people try to optimize for, what gets measured and rewarded. And that is still role based. It's not skill based, it's not outcome based. The third barrier is the leadership mindset. And this is subtle but important. Leaders are used to clear ownership, defining boundaries, control over their teams. And a skill based, flexible model that requires, you to be less predictable. It's harder to control. It's more dependent on collaboration. So even when leaders say they want agility, they default to let's define roles clearly first because that feels safer, that gives them that sense of control.
right,
The fourth barrier is that skills are defined but not used. Many organizations today have skill frameworks, competency models, capability maps, but the problem is they exist in documents, not as decision tools. For example, hiring is still done role wise, goals are still assigned role wise, work is still allocated role wise. So skills don't actually drive decisions, they just sit in presentations. So, you know, if I simplify it, organizations are trying to become skill based by changing language, but not by changing systems. And that's why the shift actually doesn't become real. Now, if you want this to work, three things need to happen. First and foremost, your work allocation needs to change. So don't assign work based on roles. Look at who has the right skills for the problem. Second is how you measure performance needs to change. So, recognizing contribution beyond role, rewarding collaboration and problem solving is what will get you there. The third thing is decision making itself needs to change. So use skills as a lens, not just titles, and then it becomes real. So a simple way to think is, right now, if you look at it, most operations operate like roles decide the work. But in a skill based model, it will be work decides who contributes, and that's the shift. So again, if I had to, summarize this in one line, it's more like organizations don't fail at becoming skill based because they lack skills. It's because they fail uh, because their systems still run on roles. That's the difference.
Sure, sure. Thank you so much. So I'll just reiterate quickly for audience's benefit. The first problem that you said is systems are not ready for that change. No matter,
Yeah,
as you said in the end also, that language can be changed, but system is the real thing that needs to be
correct.
taken into consideration. Measuring performance has been role-based, so that's another barrier. Leadership mindset and skills are defined but still not used. That's another problem. How to sort of navigate through this is work allocation that needs to be changed from to roles, from roles to capability more, and then how you measure performance, and lastly decision making, which could be the game changer here. So thank you so much. My next question, Danish, is in large complex organizations there's always a risk that flexibility leads to confusion. So how do you design work that increases agility without diluting accountability or performance?
Okay. So let me start with something very simple. Flexibility sounds great, but if you don't design it carefully, it creates confusion very quickly.
Right.
So the real question is not how do we make work flexible? The real question is how do we make work flexible and still ensure that things get done properly, right? The biggest mistake that organizations make is that they think that agility is equal to less structure. Now, because of which they kind of loosen roles, they remove boundaries, they encourage open collaboration. But what happens in this process is that people are not sure of who owns what. And then decisions get delayed, work falls through the cracks, and slowly performance drops. So the learning is that flexibility without clarity doesn't create agility, it creates anxiety. So what actually works is three simple anchors. And in my experience, if you want flexibility to work, you need these three things very clearly in place. First one is clarity of outcomes, not the role. Like I've been saying from the beginning, we need to be clear on what do we want to achieve.
Together,
uh,
even if the
Correct.
role is divided. Yeah.
Even if the role is divided. So instead of saying that this is your job, you need to say this is the outcome we need to achieve. For example, instead of defining that marketing will do this, operations will do this, uh, we define this is the customer outcome we are responsible for,
Sure.
and shift the focus from what's my role to what are we trying to deliver.
Sure.
The second thing that we need to do is define the clear ownership at any point in time. Now, work can be shared, but accountability cannot be shared endlessly. So at any given moment, it should be clear that who is driving this, who is responsible for the outcome, even if multiple people are contributing. So a simple way of thinking is many can contribute, but one must own. And very often, RACI frameworks kind of help us to define that. The third part is that we need to ensure that there is strong execution discipline. And this is generally the most underrated of the three, because flexibility works when you have clear review rhythms, regular check ins, defined decision making processes. And without this, the work becomes unstructured, reactive, inconsistent. So if you want agility, you actually need stronger systems, not weaker ones. Now, if I take an example of a cross-functional project, something like improving your customer experience. Now
Hmm.
you bring together sales, operations, product, customer support. Now, if you don't design it well, everyone contributes ideas, but no one drives execution.
Right.
Meetings happen, but decisions don't. Right? But if you apply those three anchors that I mentioned, which is defining your clear outcome. So, for example, if you say that I want to improve my customer satisfaction by X%, you define the clear owner, one person who is accountable for driving this.
Right.
And then you define the execution discipline, which is whether you're having weekly reviews, what are the clear milestones. And if you do all of this, suddenly you will notice that collaboration improves, decisions are faster, accountability, is clear. And that's the difference that the design makes. And leaders need to strike a balance, and that balance is also between two things. First is flexibility in terms of how work gets done, and clarity in what needs to be delivered and who owns it. So if you over index flexibility, you get confusion. And if you over index on structure, you get rigidity. The goal that we want is fluid work plus fixed accountability. And that needs that mindset shift, right? When you need to change that focus from defining roles, controlling execution, to focusing on defining outcomes, enabling collaboration, ensuring accountability. So leaders need to start asking, who's driving this outcome and how are we ensuring that that outcome and the plan and the milestones needed to achieve that are moving forward. So let the work flow, but uh, don't let the ownership float. That's the core idea. So, again, like I've been saying, if I had to, leave this with one thought, it's not about absence of structure, it's about presence of the right structure. And that structure is what ensures that flexibility actually leads to performance and not confusion.
Sure, sure.
I hope I answered your question.
Absolutely. Three key takeaways here, which will ensure that agility and flexibility does not dilute accountability. So number one is having that clarity of outcome. No matter how many people are collaborating, there has to be a proper goal setting done to know that where we are actually heading and what needs to be accomplished. Second was clear ownership. There has to be responsibility of stakeholders who are responsible to get that outcome, so there is no confusion. And last but not the least, having that execution discipline with reviews and milestones, etc., to ensure that the work is done. So thank you so much. Danish, my next question for you is, if you truly move from jobs to work, what happens to the core HR systems like performance management, career paths, and succession planning? Do they evolve or do they need to be fundamentally reimagined?
So let me start with a very honest answer. They cannot evolve slightly. They have to be, rethought fundamentally.
Okay,
Because all our core HR systems today are built around one assumption, that roles are stable and clearly defined. If that assumption itself changes, the systems built on top of it have to change too, right? The core problem is that HR systems are role centric. And today, most organizations are designed like this, that performance management is based on your role and your KRAs.
right,
Career paths are based on moving from one role to another. Succession planning is based on replacing one role with another person. So everything revolves around what role you are in.
right,
But if work becomes more fluid and cross functional, then this model starts to break, right? If I look at performance management, earlier you had clearly defined goals based on your role, right? You were evaluated based on how well you delivered those. But in a more flexible work based setup, people contribute across multiple areas, work is more collaborative, outcomes are shared. So performance needs to also change from, did you complete your tasks, to what outcomes did you contribute to and how. For
right,
example, recognizing cross functional contribution, measuring impact, not just activity, looking at how people enable others, not just individual delivery. So performance management itself becomes more outcome based, contribution driven, capability linked. Uh, Now, if you look at career paths, now this is where the biggest shift happens, because careers were like ladders, right? You move from one role to the next role, but now they are becoming more like networks or journeys. People build different experiences, different skills, they get exposure across functions. So instead of saying this is your next role, we need to say these are the capabilities that you will need to build next. For example, someone in operations may move to a project role. Someone in HR may take on a more business facing assignment. So role progression is more of capability progression. And if you look at succession planning also in that sense, succession planning again is very role based. Uh, we ask who is the next person for this role. Now, in a more dynamic environment, the question should actually move from, do we have the capability needed to run this function or solve this problem? So succession moves from identifying a replacement to building a bench of different capabilities. For example, instead of one successor, you may have multiple people with different strengths, each ready for different parts of the role. And this is what makes your organization more resilient. So that's where the challenge is. Many organizations talk about flexible work, skill based models, but they don't change these HR systems. So what happens next? Work becomes slightly flexible, performance careers and succession remain rigid, and that creates confusion because people don't know how they will be evaluated, how they will grow, what success looks like. So they just go to, you know just tell me my role. So if uh, I had to talk about what needs to change in simple terms, first is performance, where we measure contribution, not just role delivery, talking about what impact you created, how did you contribute across boundaries. Careers, moving to building capability journeys, not ladders, which is what skills and experiences are you building, not just what role you are moving into. And succession, moving to building capability depth, not replacements. So do we have enough people ready with the right skills? So rather than looking at HR systems in the past which answered the question who fits the role, now HR system needs to talk about, do we have the capability to win? And that's the shift. And again, that leads to kind of a mindset change from HR, mindset change for the leaders, where instead of designing roles, we design systems that enable contribution, capability building, flexibility with clarity. Because if HR systems don't change, the organization cannot change. You cannot redesign work without redesigning the systems that evaluate, grow and move people. And if those systems stay the same, then the shift from jobs to work will never fully happen.
Sure.
I hope I answered that question.
Absolutely. Beautifully put. Very well simplified, Danish. So the crux of this is, we should move our focus to contribution, more than
Yes.
the designated role. There is building capability and not the ladder, as you rightly said. Last but not the least, when it comes to succession planning, it's more of a depth and not about replacement. So you build that capability
Correct.
instead of identifying who can fit this role. So
Yes.
thank you so much. This brings us to the last question. If you had to
Sure.
challenge one deeply held belief that leaders have about jobs, roles, or talent, what would you ask them to unlearn to make the shift successful?
So if I had to pick just one belief, it would be this: that clarity and control, they come from fixed roles and rigid structures. Uh, Now, to begin with, why do leaders believe this? Because for a long time, this belief worked, right? Clearly defined roles gave clarity, hierarchy ensured control, stability helped with execution. So leaders got used to thinking that if I define roles well, things will run smoothly. And in stable environments, that was completely true.
Sure.
Now, this belief is now limiting because today work doesn't behave in a stable way anymore. Problems change quickly, work cuts across functions, solutions need collaboration. So, when leaders try to solve these dynamic problems using rigid roles, the work slows down, decisions get stuck, people start operating in silos. So, the very thing that earlier gave clarity now starts creating friction. So, leaders need to unlearn that more structure is equal to more clarity, because in today's world, too much structure can actually reduce effectiveness. Instead, they need to shift to clarity comes from outcomes, not from roles. That's the belief that I would want to replace. Now, essentially, leaders then would need to move from control to context. So instead of controlling every role, define the bigger picture and give direction. Move from ownership to accountability for outcomes. So not just this is your job, but this is what we need to achieve. And moving from roles to contribution, like I said before, focus on how people contribute, not just what their title says. Now, if I take a simple example about a team solving any business problem, now if the leader says, this is your role, stay within it, people will protect their boundaries, avoid stepping beyond. But if the leader says, this is the outcome we need to achieve, let's figure out how to solve it together, people will collaborate more, step in wherever needed, take ownership beyond roles. So it's not a capability issue, it's more of a mindset and design issue. And the balance that leaders maintain, you know uh, has to ensure that they don't create chaos. So this doesn't mean that there is no structure, there is no accountability, because that also would create chaos. Instead, leaders need to create clear outcomes, clear ownership, but flexible ways of getting there. So again, it comes back to the same thing, flexibility in work, but clarity and accountability. And the real role of a leader then starts from there, because earlier leaders were expected to define roles, control execution. Now they are more enablers, enable collaboration, remove barriers, ensure outcomes are delivered. So the shift is to enabling work to happen rather than managing roles. So if I simplify that shift, we are moving from the earlier belief that define the job and work will follow. Now it is more of define the outcome and let the work find its way. You know, the
Sure.
future will not belong to organizations with the best structures, but to the ones with the most adaptable systems. And I think that's been pretty much the theme which has been cutting across, all the questions so far.
100%. Thank you so much. So, from control to context, from ownership to accountability in order to achieve the outcome, and from roles to contributions. Beautifully put. And I just want to add one more layer to it. Given the multi-generation also, keeping that factor also in mind, the rigid and the most, if you define roles as roles, I think somewhere the creativity,
Yeah,
innovation can get lost,
true,
especially in the
true.
world that we are living in. So I think it's very important that the capability is taken into consideration in all the decision makings, and of course, system being the key to make that real shift. So thank you so much,
Absolutely.
Danish, for your time and insights today. It was my pleasure to host this conversation, and this conversation actually has reinforced an important truth, which is that work is no longer about static roles or fixed predefined determined structure. It is evolving, it is dynamic, and it is all about how you live up to that capability and collaboration that is there. So thank you so much for your insights.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Yeah.
Thank you.